On the evening of the 11th of December, 1936, at Royal Lodge, Windsor, the family gathered for dinner. The abdication had been signed the day before. The broadcast was done, the microphone switched off, the famous words already traveling across the empire. Outside, the December air was cold and still. Inside, the remnants of a household sat around a table and ate a meal that nobody wanted. Edward, who had been king that morning and was now the Duke of Windsor, was leaving the country within hours. His younger brother Albert, Bertie, who had woken that day as the Duke of York and would go to sleep as George VI, sat across from him, white-faced, barely able to speak. When the meal was over and the car was waiting, Edward turned to the brother who now carried everything he had abandoned. He bowed. And then, according to the account that has survived, he took his brother's hand and kissed it. The hand of the new king, the stammering second son, the boy who had never been meant for this, and who would spend the rest of his life being destroyed by it. That farewell, the private, ceremonial, devastating, was not the beginning of the story. It was not even the worst of it. Behind the constitutional crisis that shook the throne, behind the love affair that dominated the headlines, there was a family. And that family had been breaking for decades before the abdication made the damage visible. This is the story of Queen Mary and her 6 children, of the dynasty she built, the code she enforced, and the price that code extracted from every person who carried the Windsor name. 2 sons dead before their time, 1 son in exile, 1 daughter invisible, 1 son worn through by a role he never wanted, and 1 child, the youngest, hidden from the world and lost before he reached the age of 14. But the public story, the one about a king who gave up the throne for the woman he loved, is not where this begins. It is not even the center of what happened. To understand how a family arrived at that microphone, at that farewell, at that fracture that reshaped the British monarchy for the rest of the 20th century, you have to go back much further than December 1936. You have to go back to the family that made it all possible, and to the woman who held it together with a discipline so complete that it became, in time, indistinguishable from damage. This is the story of Queen Mary and her 6 children, Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, George, and John. It is the story of a dynasty that survived a world war, a name change, a constitutional crisis, and the deaths of 3 sons. And it is the story of what that survival cost the people who were asked to pay for it. Not one of them escaped. Some broke publicly, some broke in silence. One vanished from the family altogether before he reached the age of 14. And the woman at the center of it all, formidable, composed, draped in jewels and wrapped in the duty, outlived 3 of the 6 children she had raised to serve the crown. It begins, as these stories always do, not with grandeur, but with something more precarious. Victoria Mary, Augusta, Louise, Olga, Pauline, Claudine Agnes was born on the 26th of May, 1867, at Kensington Palace. The same palace that had sheltered Queen Victoria's early life, the same rooms where proximity to the crown was both an inheritance and an obligation. She was the daughter of Prince Francis, Duke of Teck, and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of King George III. The bloodline was impeccable, the finances were not. Her father held a title from the Kingdom of Württemberg that carried limited income and no political influence in Britain. Her mother, though popular and gregarious and warmly received by London society, was famous for spending well beyond what the family possessed. The household lurched between borrowed residences, extended stays with relatives, and the kind of genteel financial anxiety that polite society understood but did not discuss. When the creditors pressed too closely in London, the Tecks retreated to Florence, where the cost of living was lower, and where a young Princess May, and as the family called her, that could absorb her education in art, history, and languages at a fraction of the English price. She was 10 years old. She learned Italian. She visited galleries, and she learned in a way that would never leave her, that proximity to royalty was not the same as security, and that security, once lost, must be rebuilt through discipline, thrift, and the absolute suppression of anything that looked like weakness. That childhood left its mark in ways that would echo across generations. She became, by every account, a woman of extraordinary self-control, reserved where her mother had been effusive, precise where her father had been passive, and possessed of an almost scholarly devotion to the monarchy as an institution. She collected antiques with a connoisseur's eye and a near obsessive attention to provenance. She studied royal genealogy the way a soldier studies terrain. She understood, before she was 20, that her value in the marriage market of European royalty lay not in wealth or beauty, but in suitability. She was British-born, Protestant, well-connected, educated, and crucially free of scandal. What she lacked in fortune, she would compensate for in composure. It was a particular kind of preparation for a particular kind of life. And if it also meant that emotional spontaneity was trained out of her before she had the chance to decide whether she wanted it, well, that was a price she would not have recognized as a price at all. It was simply what duty required. In 1891, she was engaged to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and the heir presumptive to the throne after his father. It was a match of dynastic convenience rather than romantic passion. Albert Victor was charming in a diffuse, unsteady way, widely regarded by those who knew him as intellectually limited and physically fragile. May was serious, capable, and understood by Queen Victoria herself to be the stronger partner. The engagement, whatever personal feeling it may have contained, was built on the assumption that May would steady the heir and in time steady the crown. But the assumption lasted barely 6 weeks. On the 14th of January, 1892, at Sandringham, Albert Victor died of pneumonia during an influenza epidemic. He was 28. May was left not only bereaved, but displaced. A royal fiancé without a royal future, stranded between the world she had been promised and the world she now had to navigate alone. What happened next would have been remarkable in any era, and in the enclosed world of late Victorian royalty, it was almost without precedent. Within 18 months, May was engaged again, this time to Albert Victor's younger brother, Prince George, Duke of York, the man who had never expected to be heir and who now found himself inheriting both the succession and, in a sense, his dead brother's intended bride. Whether there was love at the outset is a question biographers have debated for over a century. George was a naval man, reserved and methodical, devoted to routine and uncomfortable with emotional display. May was controlled, intelligent, and committed to the institution, with a fervor that went beyond obligation into something closer to faith. They married on the 6th of July, 1893, at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. The union was not a love match in the way that popular romance demands. It was something more unusual and in its own way more durable, a partnership built on shared conviction. They both believed in the crown. They both believed in duty. They both believed that private feeling was a matter for private management, and that the family's purpose was to serve something larger than any individual life within it. That conviction would become the foundation of everything they built, and, in time, the source of everything that broke. There is something about George's own trajectory that matters here, because it set the pattern his sons would later repeat in far more destructive ways. He had not been raised to be king. He was a second son, a naval officer who loved the sea, who was comfortable with discipline and routine and the clear hierarchies of service life, and who had expected to spend his career in the fleet, not on the throne. Albert Victor's death thrust him into a succession he had not sought, and a public role he was not naturally suited for. He adapted, he endured, he married the woman who had been chosen for his dead brother, and built with her a partnership that functioned. But the experience left him with a deep, almost visceral conviction that duty was not a choice, but a fact. That when the institution demanded something of you, you gave it, regardless of what it cost, because the alternative was chaos. He would impose that conviction on his children with a rigidity that left no space for the possibility that some of them might break under it. He had survived the weight. He expected them to survive it too. That expectation would prove, for at least 3 of them, catastrophically wrong. The couple settled at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, a modest, almost suburban house by royal standards, tucked near the larger Sandringham House, where George's father, the future Edward VII, held court. It was cramped, poorly lit, and notably lacking in grandeur, but George loved its smallness, its routines, its proximity to the shooting, and the gardens and the life of an English country gentleman that he might have preferred to the crown had the crown not chosen him. Here, 6 children arrived in close succession: Edward, Albert, Christian, George Andrew Patrick David on the 23rd of June, 1894. Albert Frederick Arthur George on the 14th of December, 1895. Victoria Alexandra Alice Mary on the 25th of April, 1897. Henry William Frederick Albert on the 31st of March, 1900. George Edward Alexander Edmund on the 20th of December, 1902, and John Charles Francis on the 12th of July, 1905. 6 children in 11 years. A dynasty secured, a household complete. The public image was formidable. A family photograph from the period, now held in the royal collection, shows George and Mary with all 6 children arranged in careful symmetry. The boys in sailor suits, the girl in white, the parents seated with the composed authority of people who understood that a photograph was not a personal memento, but a statement of institutional continuity. It is almost too perfect for the story that follows. Every child in place, every face composed, a visual promise of order, bloodline, and the effortless reproduction of duty across generations. What the photograph could not show, what no public image of this family would ever show, was the emotional architecture of the household behind it. There is something about the way this family operated that is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains nearly everything that came after. George V was not a cruel father in any deliberate sense. He was a man of the Navy, of routine, of deep institutional loyalty, who believed that formality was the correct relationship between a parent and a child destined for public life. He expected obedience. He expected punctuality. He expected physical courage and deference to the crown. And he expressed these expectations with a rigidity that left almost no room for individual temperament, for softness, for the particular vulnerabilities of any given child. His voice, when raised, could terrify his sons. His silences, when they fell, could be worse. One biographer would later observe that he was the kind of father who frightened his children without understanding why they were frightened. He loved them. He provided for them. He prepared them, in his own estimation, for the roles they would inherit, but his love expressed itself through expectation, not tenderness, and the gap between what he offered and what some of his children needed would prove, in the end, devastating. Queen Mary's contribution to the household was different in texture, but similar in its consequences. She was not the ice queen of popular mythology. She was affectionate in private, warm in correspondence, and capable of maternal feeling that surfaces in letters and in moments biographers have occasionally uncovered. But she was also a woman who had learned from her own precarious childhood that emotion was a luxury and composure was a necessity. She believed in duty, the way some people believe in the ground beneath their feet, not as an idea, but as the thing that held everything up. In practice, this meant that the children's daily lives were organized not around parental closeness, but around routine, protocol, and the care of nurses and governesses. The nursery was the children's world. The parents' world was the crown. Visits were scheduled. Meals were formal. Affection was real but structured, filtered through the rhythms of a household that operated more like a small institution than a home. Mary loved her children, but she loved the monarchy too, and when the two loves came into conflict, as they would again and again across the decades, and the institution won, every time. The figure who occupied the space between those two worlds, and who, for the youngest children especially, became the most important emotional presence in the household, was Charlotte Bill. Known universally as Lala, she was the royal nanny who raised all 6 children and whose bond with them, particularly with the boys, was deeper and more sustaining than any relationship they had with their parents in those early years. Lala Bill was not royal. She was not grand. She was a servant in a household where servants were essential but functionally invisible. And yet, in the emotional architecture of this family, she became the closest thing several of those children had to unconditional warmth, and that fact alone tells you something about the house that George and Mary built. The love was real, but it was delegated. And the person to whom it was delegated, the person who held the children when they cried, who soothed them after their father's rages, who knew their fears and their habits and the particular texture of their unhappiness, had no power, no title, and no formal place in the family's story at all. Now consider the children themselves, not as names in a dynasty, but as individuals, each of them shaped by the same household, the same parents, the same code of emotional containment, and each of them broken by it in a different way. Edward, known within the family as David, was the eldest and the most immediately burdened. From the moment of his birth, he was the heir, the boy who would one day be king, the child upon whom the entire dynasty's future rested. He was fair-haired, slight, and possessed of a natural charm that would later make him the most popular prince in modern British history. But charm, in the household George and Mary ran, was not a virtue. It was an irrelevance. What mattered was readiness. Readiness for the crown, for duty, for the life of performance and restraint that had been prepared for him before he could walk. Even in childhood, there were signs that the role sat uneasily upon him. He was sensitive to his father's disapproval in ways that went deeper than ordinary filial anxiety. He was drawn to informality, to warmth, to the kind of emotional directness that the household could not accommodate. The distance between David, the private boy who craved affection and connection, and the Prince of Wales, who would be expected to embody the monarchy's gravitas, was already visible before he reached adolescence. He would spend the rest of his life trying to close that gap. He would fail, and the manner of his failure would shake the institution his parents had spent their lives preserving. Albert, Bertie to the family, was the second son, and in almost every respect, he was his older brother's photographic negative. Where David was outwardly confident, Bertie was painfully shy. Where David charmed rooms, Bertie dreaded them. He developed a severe stammer in early childhood that would torment him for decades, a condition almost certainly worsened by the pressures of a household where fluency was expected and vulnerability was not accommodated. He was knock-kneed, and his father insisted on corrective splints that caused him physical pain. He was naturally left-handed, and the household forced him to write with his right. His stomach troubled him. His nerves troubled him more. He was by temperament and by circumstance the child most visibly damaged by the family's code, the son who absorbed every pressure and had no mechanism for release. And yet, and this is the detail that makes his story more than merely sad, he was also conscientious, deeply religious, and possessed of a quiet, stubborn bravery that would not become visible until the worst possible moment demanded it. The boy who could not speak without stammering would one day be asked to address a nation at war, but that was decades away and nobody was preparing him for it. Nobody thought they needed to. He was despair. Princess Mary was the only daughter, and she occupied a position in the household that was fundamentally different from her brothers. She was expected to serve, but not to reign. She was dutiful, practical, and publicly uncontroversial in ways that brought the family no anxiety and earned her no particular attention. She would serve extensively in wartime charity work, marry Viscount Lascelles in 1922, and conduct a life of quiet, persistent usefulness that never once threatened the institution or generated a headline. She matters in this story not because she broke, but because she did not. And in a family where so many children fractured under the same pressures, the fact that one daughter survived by inhabiting the role more completely than any of her brothers tells you something uncomfortable about what the role demanded and about the different prices it extracted from those expected to lead and those expected to support. Henry, later the Duke of Gloucester, was the third son, military-minded by nature, more comfortable in uniform than in drawing rooms, and quietly frustrated by a royal status that prevented him from pursuing the army career he genuinely wanted. He wished to be a professional soldier, to be judged by competence rather than birth, to inhabit a world where rank was earned. That world was never fully available to him. His royal blood ensured that every posting came with protocol, every promotion came with suspicion of favor, and every achievement was shadowed by the question of whether it was real or ceremonial. He would serve. He would marry Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott in 1935. He would do what was expected with a steadiness that attracted no drama and generated no myth. In the family's larger story, Henry is the son who carried the weight without spectacle, and who, in doing so, became almost invisible. That invisibility was its own kind of damage. George, later the Duke of Kent, was the family's most intriguing and most dangerous figure. He was bright, stylish, socially daring, and possessed of a magnetism that drew people toward him in the ways the palace found difficult to manage. He was artistic where his brothers were conventional, cosmopolitan where they were insular, and restless in a way that suggested the family's code of containment was not large enough to hold him. By the late 1920s and the early 1930s, rumors clustered around him thickly of addiction, of affairs that crossed boundaries the era could barely name, of friendships with people whose company no son of George V should have been keeping. How much of this was documented fact and how much was later embellishment remains a question biographers have never settled to everyone's satisfaction. What is not in dispute is the trajectory. He joined the Navy, became the first member of the royal family to work as a civil servant at the Home Office, and married the luminous Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark in November 1934 in a wedding that briefly made the Kents the most glamorous couple in Europe. By the mid-30s, he was both the family's brightest ornament and its most volatile element, a man whose gifts and appetites existed in a tension that could not hold indefinitely. And then there was John. Prince John was born on the 12th of July, 1905, the youngest, the last, the one whose story would become, in time, the family's most haunting absence. In his earliest years, he was lively, affectionate, and by the limited accounts that survive, a child who brought a particular warmth to a household that did not always know what to do with warmth. He played with his siblings. He charmed visitors. He was photographed with the family in the years before the photographs stopped including him. But by the time he was 4, the seizures had begun. Epilepsy, in Edwardian Britain, was not merely a medical condition. It was a source of profound social stigma. Widely misunderstood, frequently confused with mental illness or hereditary degeneracy, and regarded in certain quarters as a mark of biological unfitness. For any family, this would have been difficult. For the royal family, it was something closer to an institutional crisis. The medical knowledge of the period offered little effective treatment. The social knowledge offered even less accommodation. And the family's instinct, shaped by decades of managing public perception, of presenting continuity and strength, of never allowing private difficulty to become public vulnerability, moved, as it always moved, toward containment. The household that George and Mary built was now complete. 6 children, 2 parents, and a code of conduct that valued order above intimacy and duty above comfort. It was a formidable construction. It had survived Mary's precarious girlhood, George's unexpected accession, and the enormous pressures of an empire in its final, confident decades. The coronation of 1911 had placed the family at the center of imperial spectacle. George crowned at Westminster Abbey, Mary beside him in robes and diamonds, the children arranged in their appointed places as the world watched the British monarchy perform its most sacred ritual. The Durbar in Delhi that same year extended the performance to the reaches of the empire itself. Everywhere the family went, it projected permanence, stability, the promise that this would continue. At York Cottage and later at Buckingham Palace, the rhythms of the household reinforced that promise daily. The children's lives were timetabled with military precision. Meals were formal. Visits to the parents were scheduled and brief. The children were presented, inspected, and returned to the nursery. Birthdays were acknowledged but not indulged. Affection was expressed through letters more often than through touch. George kept his study as a kind of tribunal room. The children were summoned to it when their behavior required correction, and the summons alone was enough to reduce some of them to tears. Mary, for her part, was more accessible than her husband, but no less formal in her expectations. She took the children on educational outings, to museums, to galleries, to historic sites, with the focused purposefulness of a woman who believed that understanding the past was the surest way to serve the future. It was instruction, not play. It was preparation, not childhood. And the children, each in their own way, registered the gap between what they needed and what they received. The First World War, which began when Edward was 20 and John was 9, tested the institution to its limits. Anti-German feeling ran so fierce through wartime Britain that mobs attacked shops with German-sounding names and dachshunds were stoned in the streets. The royal family, whose lineage was as German as any family in the country, faced an existential threat that was not military but cultural. The question of whether a dynasty called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha could survive as the symbol of British national identity, while British boys died in Flanders fighting Germany. George V's answer was radical and in its way brilliant. In July 1917, he renounced the family's German titles and decreed that the dynasty would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor, a name plucked from the castle, from Englishness itself, from the landscape rather than the bloodline. It was a reinvention so complete that it amounted to the monarchy rewriting its own identity in order to survive. But the reinvention also confirmed something deeper about the household George and Mary had built. Survival was paramount. Appearance was paramount. Whatever did not serve the institution's continuity would be managed, reshaped, or quietly removed. Through the war, each child was deployed according to the family's logic. Edward, the heir, served on the Western Front and not in the trenches, to his lasting frustration, but close enough to the horror to be permanently marked by it. He visited the wounded, talked to ordinary soldiers, and began to develop the populist instincts that would make him adored by the public and increasingly incomprehensible to his father. Bertie served in the Royal Navy and was present at Jutland, the great naval battle of 1916, acquitting himself with a quiet courage that his stammer would never allow him to communicate. Mary threw herself into wartime charitable work with a dedication that would define the rest of her public life. Henry was still too young for the front, but old enough to absorb the atmosphere. George was a child. And John was at Wood Farm, already separated, already fading from the family's daily consciousness. But behind the wartime image of unity, the cracks were deepening. Edward was growing into a young man whose charm concealed a deepening alienation from the role prepared for him. Bertie was struggling with a stammer and an anxiety that no amount of discipline could cure. George was displaying the appetites and the recklessness that would define his adult life. Henry was quietly disappearing into military routine. Mary was learning to serve without asking what serving cost. And John, the youngest, the most vulnerable, the one who could not be made to fit the script and was being moved gradually and with a finality that the family would not publicly discuss, to the margins of the household and then beyond them. By 1916 or 1917, John was living at Wood Farm, a modest farmhouse on the Sandringham estate in the care of Lala Bill and a small household staff. He was not locked away. He was not, by the standards of the period, mistreated. He had the Norfolk countryside to wander, a nanny who loved him fiercely, and a daily life that may, in its texture, have been gentler than the rigid formality of the main house. But he was separated from his parents, from his siblings, from the shared life that the other 5 children, however unhappily, inhabited. Whether that separation was an act of compassion, an act of concealment, or some anguished combination of both is a question that has never been fully resolved. The era's medical understanding of epilepsy was primitive. The era's social understanding was worse. And the family's understanding of itself as a public institution that could not afford the appearance of weakness made certain decisions feel to the people making them not like cruelty, but like necessity. Later generations would call him the lost prince. At the time, he was simply the child who was no longer there. The family had entered the First World War with 6 children and an image of unshakable permanence. By the time the armistice came in November 1918, the image held. The institution had survived. The name had been changed. The empire still stood, if only just. George V had emerged as a symbol of steadiness in a world remade by slaughter. Queen Mary had stood beside him, composed and resolute, the very embodiment of the endurance she believed in. But at Wood Farm, in the quiet of the Norfolk winter, a 13-year-old boy was living a life that bore no resemblance to the one his brothers and sister inhabited. His seizures were frequent now and worsening. His world had contracted to a farmhouse, a nanny, and the flat fields around Sandringham, and the family that had built its entire identity on continuity, on the seamless reproduction of duty across generations, on the promise that the name would endure, had already begun to lose one of its children, not to rebellion, not to scandal, but to something far older and less forgiving than either. That loss was about to become permanent. On the 18th of January, 1919, at Wood Farm, Prince John suffered a severe seizure in his sleep. He did not wake. He was 13 years old. Lala Bill found him. She telephoned Queen Mary. The parents came at once to Sandringham. And whatever grief passed through the house on the January day, whatever a mother felt, standing in a farmhouse over the body of the child she had borne and then by degrees let go, it passed in private, behind the walls the family had built to keep the world from seeing what the name cost the people who carried it. The family did not speak of it publicly. There was no announcement commensurate with the death of a prince, no period of court mourning that might have drawn attention to the child the public had largely forgotten existed. The court circular recorded the bare facts. John's funeral was held at the church of St. Mary Magdalene at Sandringham. Quietly, privately, without the ceremonial weight that would have attended the death of any of his older siblings. A handful of people stood in the January cold. The boy was buried in the churchyard, and the machinery of royal life, which had been constructed to absorb precisely this kind of private devastation without missing a public step, continued as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Queen Mary wrote to a friend in the days that followed. She described John's death as a great relief because his seizures had become so severe that life could only have meant continued suffering. That letter has been quoted many times since, usually as evidence of a coldness so profound that it borders on inhumanity. But there is another way to read it, and the outline of this family's story requires both readings to be held in tension rather than resolved. One reading is that Mary was a woman incapable of maternal feeling, who treated her son's death as an administrative matter to be filed and forgotten. The other is that she was a woman who had already grieved a living child, who had watched epilepsy take him by degrees across a decade, who had consented to his removal to Wood Farm because the alternatives available in 1916 were worse, and who could not, within the emotional vocabulary the household had taught her, say what she actually felt. Whether she was cold or whether she was controlled beyond the point where control and coldness become indistinguishable from each other is a question her family would spend the next century failing to answer. What is certain is that John's death established a pattern, a template that the household would repeat with each subsequent loss. Grief managed through composure, sorrow expressed through duty, and the private wound sealed behind the public face before the world had time to see it bleed. The 5 surviving children absorbed the lesson in their different ways. None of them, in the years that followed, would speak of John at any sustained length. He did not vanish entirely from family memory. Mary, the Princess Royal, would later refer to him with genuine warmth, and George V is recorded as having been deeply distressed by the death. But he was folded into the silence that the household treated as discretion and that later generations would recognize as suppression. The youngest child, the one who could not be made to fit the script, was now gone. The photograph of 6 children would not be taken again. And the 5 who remained, each carrying their own unspoken relationship to the brother, who had disappeared from daily life and then from life altogether, moved forward into the decade that would, by every external measure, look like the family's finest years. The 1920s were, for the House of Windsor, a period of remarkable public success. George V had emerged from the war as the most respected sovereign in Europe, the king who had stayed when the Romanovs fell, when the Habsburgs collapsed, when the Kaiser fled to Holland and the map of royal Europe was redrawn in blood. He had changed his family's name. He had visited munitions factories and military hospitals. He had embodied, in his stolid, undemonstrative way, exactly the kind of steadiness that a traumatized nation needed from its monarchy. Queen Mary stood beside him with the composure that was by now her defining public characteristic, erect, jeweled, immovable, as though the very concept of doubt had never occurred to her. Together they presided over a court that was formal, predictable, and deeply reassuring. The monarchy in those years was not exciting. It was something the country valued more than excitement. It was solid, and it needed to be. The 20s and 30s brought political strain that tested the institution in ways that war alone could not. The general strike of 1926, when millions of workers walked out and the country came closer to class upheaval than at any point in modern memory, demanded of the monarch a studied neutrality that George V maintained with the rigid discipline he applied to everything. He is said to have remarked privately that the striking workers were not revolutionaries but men driven to desperation, a sentiment more humane than his public position allowed him to express. The Depression years that followed brought unemployment, hunger marches, and a growing sense across the industrial heartland that the promise of post-war Britain had been broken. Through it all, George held the center. In December 1932, he delivered the first royal Christmas broadcast on the BBC, speaking directly to the nation and the empire by radio in a voice that was steady, serious, and reassuringly paternal. The words had been written by Rudyard Kipling. The effect was intimate in a way that monarchy had never been before. For the first time, the sovereign was not merely seen at a distance or read about in the court circular, but heard in living rooms and kitchens by firesides across the country. It was a modernization of the most conservative institution in Britain, and it deepened the bond between crown and public in ways that George V, with his instinct for duty over innovation, could not entirely have foreseen. But it also raised the stakes for the family behind the voice. The closer the public felt to the monarchy, the more devastating any crack in the image would be. The social world surrounding the family operated with the elaborate rhythms that the British upper classes had perfected across centuries, and that the war, despite everything, had not entirely dismantled. The season still turned on its familiar axis: Ascot, Henley, Cowes Week, the Chelsea Flower Show, the great house weekends in the Shires, where the same families gathered for shooting and conversation, and the careful maintenance of connections that were social, political, and matrimonial all at once. The court still functioned through the rituals of presentation, investiture, and the garden parties at Buckingham Palace, where proximity to the sovereign was measured in feet and minutes. And at the center of it all, the children of George and Mary were growing into the roles the household had prepared for them, or, in several cases, growing away from those roles in ways the public could not yet perceive. Edward, Prince of Wales, was the family's most visible asset and its deepest source of private anxiety. By the early 20s, he had become, without exaggeration, the most famous young man in the English-speaking world. His tours of the Dominions, Canada in 1919, Australia and New Zealand in 1920, India in 1921, and again in 1922, generated crowds and press coverage that no member of the royal family had experienced before or arguably since. He was handsome in a boyish, angular way that photographed brilliantly. He dressed with a casual flair, loose tweeds, soft collars, the Windsor knot he popularized, the younger people admired and older courtiers found alarming. He danced, he played polo with a recklessness that terrified his protection officers. He talked to ordinary people with an ease that suggested he actually listened to them. And in an era when the upper classes still maintained a studied distance from the working population, that ease was extraordinary. In the industrial towns of the Midlands and the North, where unemployment was grinding and the promise of a homes fit for heroes had curdled into slums and dole queues, Edward was greeted not merely as a prince, but as someone who appeared to understand. His wartime experience had marked him more deeply than his public manner suggested. He had served on the staff of the British Expeditionary Force in France, not in the trenches. The heir to the throne could not be risked in that way, but close enough to the bombardment, the mud, the casualty clearing stations, and the sheer industrial horror of modern warfare to be permanently altered by it. He carried from those years a genuine sympathy for ordinary suffering that coexisted uneasily with the life of privilege to which he returned. He also carried something harder to name: a disillusionment with the rituals and hierarchies that his father regarded as the very substance of monarchy. The war had shown him a world in which rank meant nothing and survival meant everything. The court to which he came home demanded that he pretend otherwise. That pretense became, over the years, intolerable to him. And the more democratic and informal he became in public, the wider the gap grew between what the institution expected and what Edward was willing to give. His private life, through the 20s and into the 30s, followed a pattern that the family found impossible to manage and chose instead to contain. He was drawn to older married women, women who offered the emotional warmth, the directness, the uncomplicated physical affection that the household at York Cottage had never provided. His long affair with Frida Dudley Ward, the wife of a Liberal member of Parliament, lasted through much of the 1920s and was known to the family, the court, and the small circle of press proprietors who still observed the gentleman's agreement that kept royal private lives out of British newspapers. His subsequent relationship with Lady Furness was similarly managed. The pattern was consistent. Edward sought women who would mother him, manage him, give him the intimacy his upbringing had denied. His father disapproved with increasing vehemence. His mother worried in the way she always worried, privately, formally, without direct confrontation. Neither parent grasped or was willing to grasp the deeper architecture of their son's need, that the heir to the throne was looking for something in his private life that the institution had systematically failed to provide, and that his search was becoming, with each successive attachment, less discreet and more desperate. Bertie, by contrast, was building something quieter and ultimately more consequential. Created Duke of York in 1920, he occupied the position the succession reserved for second sons, useful, visible, but fundamentally secondary. He was still stammering. He was still anxious in formal settings, still reduced, in the presence of his father's disapproval, to the kind of agonized self-consciousness that made even a dinner table feel like a trial. But in 1921 or early 1922, he met Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the youngest daughter of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore, raised at Glamis Castle in Forfarshire, and at St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, Scottish, warm, socially fluent, and possessed of a practical steadiness that Bertie recognized immediately as the quality he most needed and least possessed. He proposed, she declined. He proposed a second time, she declined again. Elizabeth was not, by her own later account, eager to surrender her freedom to the constraints of royal life, a reluctance that, viewed from the distance of a century, suggests she understood what the institution demanded more clearly than many of the people already inside it. But Bertie persisted with the quiet stubbornness that was his most underestimated quality. And on the 26th of April, 1923, they married at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth walked to the altar carrying a bouquet of white roses, and on her way paused to lay it on the tomb of the unknown warrior, an unscripted gesture that the press seized upon and the public adored. It was the first sign of a quality that would define Elizabeth's contribution to the monarchy for the next 8 decades, an instinct for the human moment inside the institutional occasion, for the small act of warmth that transformed ceremony into something the public could feel. There is something about this marriage that must be understood clearly, because it becomes the hinge on which the rest of the family's story turns. Elizabeth did not cure Bertie's stammer. She did not erase his insecurity or transform him into the confident figure the public role demanded. What she provided was the emotional infrastructure that allowed him to function, the steady, practical, affectionate presence that absorbed his anxiety and returned it as calm. She managed the household. She managed the social obligations. She was the one who encouraged him in 1926 to begin working with Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist practicing in Harley Street, whose unconventional methods, breathing exercises, muscle relaxation, the slow, patient rebuilding of confidence through mechanical repetition, would not cure the stammer, but would, over years of work, give Bertie enough control to function in public. The therapy was grueling. It required Bertie to confront the physical reality of his impediment in sessions that stripped away the defenses he had spent a lifetime constructing. But Elizabeth pushed for it, attended to it, made it part of the architecture of their shared life. She managed with increasing skill the public image of a couple that was warm, approachable, and reassuringly domestic in ways that the wider family was not. Their daughters, Elizabeth, born on the 21st of April, 1926, and Margaret Rose, born on the 21st of August, 1930, completed a family life that was, by every surviving account, genuinely happy. The little house at 145 Piccadilly, before the families later moved to Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, became a place where affection was expressed openly and where the rigid formality of George V's household was quietly, without confrontation, set aside. The Yorks were the family's model couple, and their happiness rested on an assumption so fundamental that no one thought to question it, that Edward would marry, produce an heir, and carry the crown, and that Bertie and Elizabeth would be left in peace to live the private life they had built together. Princess Mary had married Viscount Lascelles, later the 6th Earl of Harewood, in February 1922. Lascelles was 15 years her senior, wealthy, a collector and patron of the arts, and temperamentally reserved in a way that suited the household's code of emotional containment. The marriage was respectable rather than passionate. Mary bore 2 sons, George in 1923 and Gerald in 1924, and settled into the life of a titled Englishwoman at Harewood House in Yorkshire and at Goldsborough Hall, conducting herself with a competence that attracted no headlines and generated no drama. She maintained a close relationship with her parents, particularly her mother, and continued the charitable work that gave her public life its quiet, steady purpose. In the larger story of her siblings, Mary's significance lies precisely in what did not happen to her. She did not rebel. She did not break. She did not become a source of scandal or crisis. She inhabited the role with the thoroughness her mother valued above all else. That she did so without apparent cost, or at least without any cost that reached the public record, makes her the family's most instructive comparison point. The same household that produced Edward's revolt and Bertie's anguish also produced Mary's compliance. The code broke some children and sustained others, and the difference had everything to do with what each child needed and nothing to do with what the code was willing to give. Henry had married Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott in November 1935, a match that should have been celebrated at Westminster Abbey but was moved to the private chapel at Buckingham Palace after the death of Alice's father, the Duke of Buccleuch. Henry took the change in stride, as he took most things, with the stoic pragmatism of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that his life would be shaped by decisions made above him. His marriage was solid. His ambitions remained modest and military. He wanted to serve and to be left as much as possible alone. The palace accommodated this wish to the extent that it could, which was never quite enough. George of Kent's marriage to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark on the 29th of November 1934 at Westminster Abbey was an event of an entirely different order. Marina was the daughter of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia, a lineage that connected the Kents through Marina's mother to the murdered Romanovs and to the lost world of pre-revolutionary European royalty. She was startlingly beautiful, impeccably dressed, and cultivated in a way that made the English court look provincial by comparison. She spoke several languages. She understood art. She carried herself with a poise that was not English reserve, but something more fluid, more European, more consciously elegant. The wedding attracted 250,000 spectators to the streets of London. The Pathé newsreels made Marina's face one of the most recognizable in Britain overnight. Their home at 3 Belgrave Square became a gathering place for artists, musicians, designers, and the kind of progressive society that George V's court regarded with instinctive suspicion. George was, by temperament, the family's most interesting and most cultivated member, the brother who collected art, who played the piano with genuine skill, who understood instinctively why beauty mattered, and who found the tweedy Philistinism of the English upper classes stifling. He was also, by multiple later biographical accounts, the brother whose appetites had led him into territory the family found genuinely alarming. The precise nature and extent of those difficulties in the late 1920s and early 30s, the period when persistent rumors placed him in the company of drug users, in relationships that defied the era's conventions, and in circles that ranged from the adventurous to the genuinely dangerous, has never been established beyond dispute. What is documented is that by the time of his marriage, the crisis was believed to have passed. Marina was credited with having steadied him. The Kents had a son, Edward, in 1935. A daughter, Alexandra, followed in 1936. They were popular, attractive, and apparently stable. The harbor seemed to hold. But no harbor in this family held for long. George V's health had been declining for years. The severe bronchial illness that nearly killed him in November 1928, an infection so serious that the Prince of Wales was summoned home from a tour of East Africa, had left the king weakened in ways that his public schedule, carefully managed by the household, largely concealed. By the mid-30s, he was visibly aging. His energy was diminished. His patience with Edward's lifestyle had eroded to something close to despair. He is reported to have said, in one of the remarks that has passed into royal legend, that he hoped to God that nothing would come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne. A statement so blunt in its implication that it amounted to a father declaring aloud that his eldest son should not be king. Whether those precise words were spoken or whether they crystallized later from the family's collective anxiety matters less than the fact that they captured something real. George V did not trust his heir. And his heir, by the time the old king was dying, had already met the woman who would make that distrust prophetic. Wallis Simpson, born Bessie Wallace Warfield in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania in 1896, raised in Baltimore, married first to Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a naval aviator, and then to Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American shipping executive, had entered Edward's life around 1931, introduced through the social circles that orbited Lady Furness. She was not conventionally beautiful. She was not titled, not wealthy, not possessed of any of the qualities that the court circular would have recognized as qualifying a woman for royal attention. But she was sharp, direct, witty, and, crucially, willing to treat Edward not as a prince, but as a person. She did not defer. She did not flatter. She told him what she thought, managed his moods with a briskness that bordered on maternal authority, and provided, in the emotional vacuum of his life, exactly the combination of control and intimacy that he had been searching for since childhood. By 1934, the relationship had become the worst-kept secret in London society. Now, by 1935, it was the dominant anxiety of the court, the government, and the family. Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson was proceeding. Edward's intentions were becoming unmistakable. And the question that no one wanted to ask, and what happens when the King of England insists on marrying a woman the Constitution will not accept, was moving from the theoretical to the imminent. On the 20th of January 1936 at Sandringham, George V died. He was 70 years old. The official cause was a bronchial condition that had deteriorated over the preceding days. Decades later, it would emerge that Lord Dawson of Penn, the royal physician, had administered a lethal injection of morphine and cocaine to hasten the end, timed, according to Dawson's own diary, so that the death could be announced in the morning edition of the Times rather than in the less dignified evening papers. Even at the last management, even at the deathbed, the public face. The nation mourned a king who had embodied duty for a quarter of a century. Queen Mary, now the Queen Dowager, stood in black beside the coffin with the composure that was, by this point, her defining characteristic. She had lost her husband. She had lost her youngest son 17 years before, and the eldest son who now ascended the throne. The son who was at that very moment consumed by his relationship with an American divorcee named Wallace Simpson was about to inflict upon her and upon the institution she had spent her life serving the deepest wound of all. Edward's reign lasted 326 days. The crisis that destroyed it had been building for years, known to the family and the government, but invisible to the British public, whose newspapers still observed the convention that shielded royal private lives from scrutiny. Wallace Simpson was sharp, stylish, American, twice divorced, and, in the eyes of the British establishment, categorically impossible as a queen consort. The Church of England would not sanction the marriage. The government, led by Stanley Baldwin, would not accept a morganatic compromise. The Dominion prime ministers, consulted through the formal channels of imperial governance, would not support any arrangement that placed a divorced woman beside the sovereign. Edward was offered a choice that was, in constitutional terms, absolute. The crown or Wallace. He chose Wallace. The weeks leading up to the abdication were a kind of agony for the family that the public, still largely uninformed, could not perceive. Bertie wrote in his diary of being unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to comprehend that the catastrophe he had spent his entire life believing impossible was actually unfolding. He visited Edward repeatedly, trying to understand, trying to dissuade, trying to prepare himself for what he already knew was coming. The conversations, by Bertie's own later account, were painful and inconclusive. Two brothers who loved each other, shaped by the same household, speaking across a gulf that neither temperament nor affection could bridge. Edward had made his decision. It was in his own framework, an act of honesty, the refusal to live a lie, the insistence on placing personal truth above institutional duty. In his mother's framework and in Bertie's, it was something closer to desertion. The same household had taught them all the same code. Edward broke it. Bertie would have to live with the consequences. On the 10th of December, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, his country retreat near Windsor, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. His three surviving brothers stood as witnesses. Bertie, white-faced and shaking. Henry, stoic in the military bearing that was his natural register. George, who wept. The following day, the 11th of December, the abdication was given legal effect by His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act. That evening, Edward sat before a microphone at Windsor Castle and delivered the broadcast that would become one of the most famous pieces of spoken English in the 20th century. He told the Empire that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king as he would wish to do without the help and support of the woman he loved. Later that night, a dinner was held at Royal Lodge, Windsor. The family gathered: Bertie, now George VI, the Queen Dowager, the brothers and their wives, the remnants of a household about to lose one of its own. And then Edward left. He left the lodge, left the family, left the country. The details of the final farewell between the brothers have been recorded in several accounts, and in at least one version, Edward bowed to his younger brother and kissed his hand, an act of ceremonial deference that reversed the order of a lifetime, and that, whether it happened exactly as later described or was shaped by memory into the form that most precisely captured its meaning, remains one of the most devastating images in the family's entire history. The heir knelt to despair. The prince who fled paid obeisance to the prince who stayed. And then he was gone. Into the night, into a car, onto a destroyer, and across the channel to a life that would unfold for the next 36 years in the half-light of a man who had once been king and would never quite become anything else. For Queen Mary, the abdication was not a love story. It was a dereliction, a violation of the covenant between sovereign and nation that she believed to be sacred, immutable, and beyond the reach of personal desire. She had married a man she did not choose. She had surrendered her own warmth, her own spontaneity, her own maternal instincts to the demands of the institution. She had buried a child and borne the loss in silence. And now her eldest son, the child she had raised from birth to carry the crown, was walking away from it for a woman the Constitution could not accommodate and the family would not accept. Her response was not anger, or not only anger. It was a withdrawal of understanding so total that it amounted to a permanent rupture. She would not receive Wallace. She would not, for years, fully restore her relationship with the son she now regarded as a deserter from the only cause that mattered. The wound was dressed in formality. Letters were exchanged, courtesies were observed, but the wound did not close. And Bertie, the stammering second son, the spare, the boy who had been knock-kneed and left-handed and terrified of his father's rages, was now King George VI. The brother who had been most damaged by the family's code of emotional containment was now required to embody everything that code demanded. Elizabeth stood beside him. His mother stood behind the institution. His brother was packing for exile in France. And the country, which had just lost one king to love, was about to discover whether the one it got instead could bear the weight that love had refused to carry. He was 41 years old. He had a stammer that seized his throat in moments of pressure. He had two young daughters who would now grow up inside the palace walls. And the war that would test him and the monarchy and the nation beyond anything his father's generation had endured, was less than 3 years away. The coronation of George VI took place on the 12th of May, 1937, the date that had originally been set for Edward's coronation, because the machinery of state, once set in motion, does not easily change its calendar. Westminster Abbey was prepared. The regalia was brought from the Tower. The peers assembled in their robes. The Empire tuned its wireless sets, and the man who stood at the center of it all, the man for whom none of this had been intended, the man whose stammer had once made his father despair, and whose anxiety had been the family's quiet, persistent concern for decades, was crowned King of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, defender of the faith, Emperor of India. Elizabeth was crowned beside him as Queen Consort. Their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, watched from the royal gallery. Two little girls in miniature robes and coronets, the elder of whom was now, at 11 years old, heir presumptive to the throne. The younger, Margaret, 6 years old, fidgeted through the 3-hour ceremony and later told her parents she thought the service very, very long. A remark that, in its cheerful irreverence, captured something about the gap between the institution's solemnity and the children who were born into it. Queen Mary, the Queen Dowager, attended as well, breaking precedent to do so. No dowager queen had attended the coronation of a successor in modern British history. The tradition held that the previous reign must yield entirely to the new one, its living representative stepping back from the center stage. But Mary insisted. Her presence was not merely sentimental. It was a constitutional statement. The institution continued. The line held. The abdication had damaged the crown but had not broken it. She sat in the abbey in her diamonds and her composure, a woman of 70 who had survived a precarious childhood, an unexpected marriage, the death of a son, a world war, and the betrayal of an heir, and she watched her second son receive the anointing that her eldest son had thrown away. If the moment caused her pain, and it must have, though she would never have said so, she bore it as she bore everything. In silence, behind the face the public knew, with the discipline that had become indistinguishable from her identity. The early months of George VI's reign were consumed by the practical and emotional work of stabilizing a monarchy that had been shaken to its constitutional foundations. The government had managed the abdication with remarkable legislative efficiency, but the human damage was deeper and slower to repair. Bertie, George VI now, though the name still sat on him like a suit cut for another man, was terrified. He said so privately, in language that his biographers have recorded with a sympathy that the household of his childhood would never have permitted. He wept in front of his mother. He raged in moments of private despair at the brother who had left him carrying a weight that neither his temperament nor his training had prepared him for. He experienced, in the weeks after the coronation, a kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into something closer to psychological crisis. The accumulated pressure of a lifetime's anxiety concentrated into the single, inescapable reality that he was now the king, that the stammer was still there, that the eyes of the empire were on him, and that failure was not permitted. He turned to Elizabeth, who absorbed the fear and returned it as purpose. She was, in those early months, not merely a supportive wife, but a structural necessity, the person who mediated between the man and the role, who managed his schedule so that the worst provocations of his stammer could be anticipated and navigated, who created around him the domestic warmth that made the institutional coldness of Buckingham Palace bearable. She was also, in ways that the public would not fully appreciate for decades, a formidable political operator. a woman who understood instinct, impression, and the careful management of public affection with a skill that none of the Windsors, raised in the rigidity of George V's household, had ever possessed. And he turned with renewed urgency to Lionel Logue, because the king who now had to speak to the nation at state openings and investitures at the Christmas broadcast his father had inaugurated could not afford to be the man who could not speak. The speech therapy intensified. Logue attended rehearsals for every major address. The two men developed a rhythm of preparation that was part medical treatment and part friendship, one of the few genuinely equal relationships in George VI's life, built on the shared understanding that the stammer was not a weakness to be hidden, but a condition to be worked with, managed, and in the best moments transcended. The Yorks moved from their comfortable domestic life at 145 Piccadilly to the vast, drafty formality of Buckingham Palace, and the transition was felt by every member of the family as a loss. The loss of the small, private world they had built, and the beginning of a life lived entirely inside the institution's gaze. The palace was enormous, cold, understaffed by wartime standards, and possessed of a gloom that the family's presence could not dispel. The corridors echoed. The rooms were too large for a family of four. Margaret, the younger daughter, would later recall the move with an unhappiness that decades did not soften. The end of something, she said, the end of the life they had known. Elizabeth, the elder, absorbed the change with the composure that was already becoming her defining quality. But even she felt the shift. They were no longer a family living in a house. They were the royal family living in a palace. The distinction was not trivial. But George VI worked. He worked at being king with the dogged, unglamorous, almost painful persistence that was his most underestimated quality. The quality his father had never recognized and his brother had never possessed. He received his ministers, he read his boxes, he made his speeches, each one a private ordeal that the public never fully understood. And slowly, painfully, the country began to see something in its accidental king that it had not expected to find. A man whose very vulnerability made him trustworthy, whose visible struggle to perform his duties conveyed a sincerity that Edward's effortless charm had never quite achieved. Meanwhile, the brother who had caused the crisis was constructing a very different life and generating in the process a very different kind of damage. Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, had married Wallis Simpson on the 3rd of June 1937 at the Château de Condé in the Loire Valley. The wedding was a small, awkward affair. No member of the royal family attended. The Church of England refused to provide a clergyman. The service was conducted by a vicar from County Durham who had offered his services against the wishes of his bishop. The Duchess of Windsor, as Wallis now became, was denied the style of Royal Highness, a deliberate slight engineered by the palace and endorsed by the government that Edward regarded as a personal humiliation and that poisoned his relationship with his family for the rest of his life. The new king had not wanted to inflict the wound. Elizabeth, his wife, was widely believed to have been instrumental in ensuring that the distinction was withheld. The bitterness that flowed from that single decision would outlast every person involved in it. But the Duke of Windsor's grievances were about to become the least of the family's concerns, because the Duke of Windsor was about to do something far more damaging than abdicate. In October 1937, Edward and Wallis visited Nazi Germany as personal guests of Adolf Hitler. They toured factories. They visited a labor camp. They were photographed with senior Nazi officials. And Edward, in a moment that has been debated by historians ever since, was photographed giving what appeared to be a Nazi salute. Whether the gesture was deliberate, reflexive, or simply the product of a man too socially careless to understand what he was doing has never been settled. What was settled, immediately and permanently, was the damage. The British government was appalled. The palace was horrified. And the family, already reeling from the abdication, already trying to rebuild the monarchy's credibility under a new and uncertain king, was handed a crisis of association that would shadow Edward for the rest of his life and that would provide, for Queen Mary, yet another reason to regard her eldest son's choices as a betrayal not merely of his family but of his country. There is something worth pausing over here because the Germany visit crystallized a pattern that the family would repeat across generations: the management of a dangerous member through distance, formality, and the careful withholding of information. Edward was not confronted. He was not publicly repudiated. He was managed, kept at arm's length, given a title and a financial settlement, and gradually moved to the margins of the family's life in a way that echoed, in its broad outlines, the treatment of another family member who had been deemed too dangerous for the center. John had been moved to Wood Farm. Edward was moved to Paris. The mechanisms were different. The institutional instinct was the same. The world, however, was not going to give the family time to heal. By 1938, the European crisis that had been building since Hitler's rise to power was moving toward its climax. The Munich Agreement in September of that year bought a year of peace that almost nobody in the government believed would last. George VI, who had stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with Neville Chamberlain and waved to the crowd celebrating the agreement, was privately more skeptical than his public endorsement suggested. He was learning under the pressure of events to be a better reader of politics than his upbringing had prepared him to be. Elizabeth was learning with him, and the institution that George V and Queen Mary had built to withstand war, scandal, and constitutional crisis was about to face all three simultaneously. In June 1939, George VI and Elizabeth undertook a tour of Canada and the United States, the first visit by a reigning British monarch to North America. The trip was a triumph. In Washington, they dined with President Roosevelt. At the New York World's Fair, they were mobbed by crowds whose enthusiasm startled the British press. The visit served a dual purpose that was never quite stated aloud. It demonstrated that the new king could function on the world stage, and it laid the groundwork for the Anglo-American alliance that would become, within months, essential to Britain's survival. George returned to England with his confidence visibly strengthened. He had done what Edward, with all his charm, had never been asked to do. He had represented the crown abroad under the most testing conditions imaginable, and he had not broken. On the 3rd of September, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. George VI addressed the nation by radio that evening in a broadcast that the entire country knew would test the king's stammer as nothing had tested it before. He spoke slowly. He paused. The hesitations were audible. But he spoke, and the very difficulty of the speaking, the visible, audible evidence that this man was struggling to do what duty demanded, gave the words a weight that fluency could not have achieved. The nation heard its king fighting to address them, and it understood, in a way that required no explanation, that this was a man who would not abandon his post. The war years cracked open each member of the family along the fault lines that had been forming since childhood, and the divergences that had been building across the previous decade now became absolute. George VI became the wartime king, the role that would define him, redeem him, and ultimately consume him. He and Elizabeth made the decision, controversial at the time, legendary in retrospect, to remain at Buckingham Palace throughout the Blitz rather than evacuate to the safety of Windsor Castle or, as some advised, urgently recommended, to Canada. The reasoning was partly strategic and partly moral. The sovereign could not be seen to flee while his subjects were dying in their beds. But there was something else in the decision, something more personal. George VI had spent his entire life being told he was not enough, not confident enough, not fluent enough, not the son his father wanted, not the king the country expected. Now, with bombs falling on London, he had an opportunity to prove that the qualities the institution had always undervalued, endurance, stubbornness, the willingness to show up when every instinct screamed to hide, were precisely the qualities the moment demanded. The Blitz began in earnest in September 1940. Night after night, the Luftwaffe attacked London and the industrial cities. The East End burned. Families slept in underground stations. Entire streets were reduced to rubble. And the king and queen went out into it. They visited bombed neighborhoods while the fires were still smoking. They walked through ruins in their carefully chosen outfits, Elizabeth in her pastel coats and hats, George in his naval uniform. And they talked to people who had lost everything. The visits were choreographed inevitably. The press was present, the photographs served a purpose, but the danger was real, and on the 13th of September, 1940, it came directly to them. That morning, a lone German bomber, flying along the Mall at low altitude, dropped a stick of 6 bombs on Buckingham Palace. The king and queen were in a small sitting room overlooking the quadrangle when the bombs fell. The window shattered, the chapel was destroyed, a workman was injured, the explosion left a crater in the courtyard. George and Elizabeth were shaken but unhurt. Elizabeth's reported response, that she was glad the palace had been bombed because now she could look the East End in the face, has been repeated so many times that it has acquired the quality of myth. But whether the words were spoken exactly as later recorded matters less than what they represented. A queen consort who understood, with an instinct her mother-in-law would have recognized, that shared suffering was the monarchy's most powerful currency, and that the palace's broken windows bought something no amount of ceremony could have purchased. The bombing of Buckingham Palace was not an isolated incident. The palace was hit on multiple occasions during the war, and the king and queen continued to live there, or rather to work there during the day and retreat to Windsor for the nights, a compromise that preserved both the symbolism and the safety. George VI's wartime broadcasts became occasions of national significance, each one an ordeal for the man delivering it and a source of reassurance for the millions listening. His Christmas broadcast of 1939, his first wartime address, had been painfully difficult, the pauses and hesitations audible to anyone who listened. But the country did not mock. The country understood. And as the war continued, as the broadcast continued, as the stammer was fought and managed and endured, the king's voice became something it had never been before the crisis. Trusted. Not smooth, not commanding, not the voice of a natural leader, but honest. And in a war defined by propaganda and lies, honesty had a force that eloquence could not match. The princesses were evacuated to Windsor Castle, where they spent the war years in a routine of lessons, pantomimes, and the carefully managed normality that Elizabeth and the household constructed around them. The elder Princess Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1945, learning to drive and maintain military vehicles, a gesture that was partly symbolic and partly genuine, and that gave the heir to the throne her first experience of a world beyond the palace walls. Queen Mary, now 72 when the war began, was evacuated from London to Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the home of her niece, the Duchess of Beaufort. She went reluctantly. London was her world, as the palace, the galleries, the institutions she had spent decades supporting, and leaving it felt like a diminishment. But she went because duty required it, and she spent the war years at Badminton with the fierce, slightly eccentric energy of a woman who could not bear to be idle. She organized salvage drives. She supervised the clearing of undergrowth on the estate with a zeal that became locally famous and that the Duchess of Beaufort's gardening staff regarded with something between admiration and alarm. She knitted. She wrote letters. She maintained, in the countryside of wartime England, the rigid personal discipline that had defined her entire life. And she waited for news of her sons, news that, for one of them, would be the worst she had ever received. Edward, Duke of Windsor, was sent to the Bahamas. It was, by every honest assessment, an exile dressed as an appointment. In September 1940, he was made governor of the Bahamas, a post so remote from the centers of power that it amounted to diplomatic quarantine. The appointment had been engineered by Churchill, who had taken over as prime minister in May 1940 and who, despite a personal affection for Edward that predated the abdication, understood that the Duke could not be allowed to remain in Europe. The concerns were not merely political. Intelligence reports suggested that German agents had made overtures to Edward during his time in Spain and Portugal in the summer of 1940, when the Windsors were fleeing France after the German invasion. The precise nature of those contacts has been debated by historians ever since, with some accounts alleging that elements of the German government explored the possibility of using Edward as a political tool in the event of a British collapse. Whether those plans were serious, whether Edward was aware of them, and whether he would have cooperated are questions the documentary record has never fully settled. What is beyond dispute is that the government wanted him far from the war, and Nassau accomplished that purpose with brutal efficiency. Edward and Wallace arrived in the Bahamas and found themselves in a colonial backwater that bore no resemblance to the life they had constructed in pre-war Paris. Edward governed with a mixture of conscientiousness and petulance, working to improve conditions for the island's black population in ways that were progressive for the era, while simultaneously complaining, in letters to friends and family, about the boredom, the heat, the inadequacy of government house, and the indignity of being treated as a minor colonial functionary when he had once been sovereign of the largest empire in human history. Wallace found Nassau intolerable and made her displeasure known, with a frankness that charmed no one in London. The contrast between the two brothers' wars, George VI under bombardment at Buckingham Palace, Edward sweltering in a Caribbean posting he regarded as beneath him, became, in the family's private reckoning and in the judgment of history, the most damning evidence of what the abdication had actually meant. One brother had chosen love over duty, the other had duty forced upon him and had risen to meet it. The institution that Queen Mary had spent her life preserving had found its justification not in the son she prepared for the throne, but in the son she had overlooked. Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, continued her wartime service with the same quiet, relentless competence that had defined her public life since 1914. She was colonel-in-chief of several regiments. She visited military hospitals across the north of England, traveling from Harewood House in Yorkshire to wherever the wounded needed a royal presence that was practical rather than decorative. She supported the voluntary organizations, the Women's Land Army, the Red Cross, the Women's Royal Naval Service, that kept the home front functioning. She did what was required, attracted no attention to herself, and remained the sibling whose very steadiness made her almost invisible in the family's more dramatic narrative. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, served as chief liaison officer with the British Expeditionary Force in France during the early months of the war, a posting that put him closer to combat than any of his siblings and that ended with the chaotic evacuation in 1940. He would later, in January 1945, be appointed Governor General of Australia, a role that took him and Alice to the other side of the world for 2 years, and that gave Henry, at last, a purpose commensurate with the service he had always wanted to give. It was not a military command, but it was real, and it was far from the family. And for a man who had spent his life being the invisible brother, that distance was not entirely unwelcome. Queen Mary, now 72 when the war began, was evacuated from London to Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the seat of her niece Mary Somerset, Duchess of Beaufort. She went with profound reluctance. London was her world, the palaces, the galleries, the auction rooms, the institutions she had spent half a century supporting, and leaving it felt like a diminishment, a concession to age and danger that her pride resisted. But she went because the government made clear that the Queen Dowager's presence in a city under nightly bombardment was a liability the war effort could not afford, and because duty, as always, overruled desire. At Badminton, she imposed upon the household a wartime discipline that combined her natural rigidity with a physical energy that startled everyone who witnessed it. She organized salvage drives across the estate and surrounding villages, collecting scrap metal, paper, and rubber with the systematic thoroughness of a quartermaster. She supervised the clearing of overgrown hedgerows and dead wood on the Badminton grounds with such tireless vigor that it became a local legend. Gangs of estate workers pressed into service by a septuagenarian Queen Dowager who regarded idleness as a form of treason. She knitted. She wrote letters in her careful hand. She maintained in the Gloucestershire countryside the personal routine that had governed her life since girlhood. Up early, dressed formally, every hour accounted for, no complaint uttered aloud. And she waited for news of her surviving son, the king under the bombs, the Duke in the RAF, the Duke in his Caribbean exile, with the controlled anxiety of a woman who had already buried one child and who understood, with a clarity that peacetime had allowed her to suppress, that the war could take another. And George, Duke of Kent, joined the Royal Air Force. He had transferred from the Royal Navy to the RAF in April 1940, taking the rank of Air Commodore and throwing himself into the war effort with an energy that surprised those who remembered the louche, troubled prince of the previous decade. The transformation was not complete. George remained in private the most emotionally volatile of the brothers, the one whose mood swung between exhilaration and darkness, whose need for stimulation had not been cured by marriage, but merely redirected. But the war gave him something that the peace years never had, a structure demanding enough to absorb his restlessness and a purpose large enough to give his energy somewhere to go. He undertook the morale-boosting visits to RAF stations across Britain, inspecting crews, touring hangars, talking to the young pilots and navigators who were fighting the air war. He flew frequently, accompanying inspection tours and observation flights with a casualness about personal danger that his protection officers found difficult to manage and that his family, when they heard of it, found alarming. Marina, at their home in Buckinghamshire, managed the household and the children, with the quiet competence that had always been her contribution to the marriage. Their eldest, Edward, was 7, Alexandra was 6, and Marina was pregnant again. The baby is a son, Michael George Charles Franklin, was born on the 4th of July, 1942, at Coppins, the family's country house in Iver, Buckinghamshire. The timing was difficult, at wartime, rationing, the constant uncertainty of a household whose father was in active service. But the birth was safe, and for a few summer weeks the Kents existed in the fragile normality that wartime families learned to treasure without trusting. George seemed settled. The marriage was holding. The children were healthy. The worst of whatever had troubled him in the 20s and 30s appeared to be behind him. Marina allowed herself to believe that the harbor at last was real. 7 weeks later, on the 25th of August, 1942, George left Coppins for the last time. He traveled north to Invergordon, in the Scottish Highlands, where a short Sunderland flying boat, a large four-engine maritime patrol aircraft, serial number W4026, was waiting to carry him to Iceland. The purpose of the trip was a morale visit to RAF personnel stationed in Reykjavik. It was routine by wartime standards. The Duke had made similar flights before. He boarded the aircraft with 10 crew members and 3 other passengers. The Sunderland took off from the Cromarty Firth in the early afternoon. The weather over northern Scotland was deteriorating. Low cloud had settled over the hills of Caithness and Sutherland. Rain was falling intermittently, and visibility was poor. The flight path would take the aircraft northwest across the Scottish mainland before heading out over the Atlantic toward Iceland. The Sunderland never reached the coast. Approximately 30 minutes after takeoff, flying at low altitude through cloud and rain, the aircraft struck the hillside near Eagle's Rock, a remote slope above the village of Berrydale on the Dunbeath estate in Caithness. The impact was catastrophic. The flying boat broke apart on the heather-covered hillside and caught fire. Of the 15 people on board, 14 were killed instantly or died in the wreckage. One man, the rear gunner, Flight Sergeant Andrew Jack, survived, thrown clear of the fuselage by the force of the impact. He was found hours later, badly injured on the hillside. The Duke of Kent was not among the survivors. He was 39 years old. His youngest child was 7 weeks old. His wife was at home in Buckinghamshire, waiting for him to return from a trip she had expected to last a few days. The exact cause of the crash has been investigated, debated, and disputed for over 8 decades. The official inquiry attributed it to navigational error. The aircraft had deviated from its intended course and was flying too low over high ground and poor visibility. Later theories have proposed instrument failure, pilot fatigue, and, in the furthest reaches of speculation, sabotage or deliberate destruction. Conspiracy theories have clustered around the crash since the 1980s, fed by the secrecy that wartime censorship imposed on the details and by the enduring fascination that surrounds any royal death in ambiguous circumstances. None of the conspiracy theories have been substantiated by the documentary evidence available. What the evidence supports is simpler and in its own way more devastating. A routine wartime flight, bad weather, a hillside that the crew did not see, and a death that was as random and as wasteful as any of the tens of thousands of deaths that the war was producing every month. What is not debated and what requires no investigation and no theory is what the crash did to the family that received the news. Queen Mary received the news at Badminton. The details of how she was told, who telephoned, what words were used, how she responded in the first seconds after hearing that her 4th son was dead, have not survived in the public record with the specificity that the moment deserves. What has survived is the pattern. She had been here before. 23 years earlier, at Sandringham, she had received a telephone call about John, the youngest, the epileptic child who had been moved to Wood Farm and who had died in his sleep at 13. That loss had been absorbed in silence, processed through composure, folded into the family's code of managed grief. Now the code was being tested again, and this time the loss was different in every dimension except one. It was once more a son. George had been 39. He had been healthy, active, in the prime of his life. He had a wife and 3 children, the youngest 7 weeks old. He had not died of illness or age or the slow erosion that a family might prepare for. He had died in a plane crash on a Scottish hillside, suddenly, violently, in the middle of a war, on what should have been a routine flight to Iceland. The randomness of it, the sheer brutal contingency of a navigational error or a bank of cloud or a few hundred feet of altitude that might have cleared the hillside, made the loss not only devastating but bewildering. There was no pattern to make sense of. There was no narrative of decline. There was only the fact that George had boarded an aircraft in the afternoon and was dead before evening, and that Marina was now a widow with 3 children under the age of 8, and that Queen Mary, at 75, had outlived a second child. Marina's grief was absolute and unapologetic. She had loved George, loved him with the passionate European intensity that had distinguished the Kent marriage from the more restrained partnerships of the other Windsor brothers. and his death shattered her in ways that the family's code of composure could not contain, and to her credit, she did not attempt to pretend. She withdrew from public life almost entirely in the months that followed. She wore black, and she would continue to wear mourning for years. She retreated to Coppens with her 3 children, Edward, 7, Alexandra, 5, and Michael, 7 weeks old, the baby who would never know his father, and the small household staff who remained. The eldest boy, Edward, inherited his father's title. At 7 years old, he was now the Duke of Kent, a weight of name and expectation that settled on his narrow shoulders before he could possibly understand what it meant. The palace offered support, practical, financial, institutional, but the palace could not offer what Marina had lost, which was the specific person, the husband who had played the piano in the drawing room at Coppens, who had brought home paintings and talked about art, who had held his baby son in the weeks before he left for Scotland. George VI wrote to Marina with a tenderness that revealed beneath the wartime king's composure the anxious, empathetic brother who had never hardened entirely into his role. Queen Mary visited when wartime travel permitted, bringing with her the particular form of comfort she knew how to give: practical attention, disciplined kindness, the reassurance that the family would support the widow and the children. Whether she spoke about her own losses, about John, about the particular cruelty of outliving a child, the record does not say. It would have been unlike her. Mary's grief lived in a room she had locked decades earlier, and she did not, as a matter of character or conviction, open that door for others. The war continued for 3 more years after George's death. The family continued with it, each member carrying the weight in the way their nature permitted, but the Kent crash had changed something in the family's internal calculus that could not be undone. The Windsors had now lost 2 of the 6 children, John to epilepsy, George to a wartime accident. And the surviving 4 were diminished not only in number, but in the unspoken confidence that had once sustained them. The dynasty that had been built on the promise of continuity was thinning. The generation that George V and Queen Mary had raised to carry the name forward was being consumed by the institution's demands, by the era's catastrophes, by the particular individual costs of being born into a family where private life was never entirely private and where duty left very little room for the person underneath. The Duke of Kent was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 29th of August, 1942, 4 days after the crash. The funeral was private, wartime austerity and security preventing the full ceremonial honors that a royal funeral would normally have commanded. George VI attended. Queen Mary attended. The surviving brothers were present. Edward, Duke of Windsor, was not. He was in Nassau, thousands of miles away, and the logistics of wartime travel made his attendance impossible, even if the family had wanted him there. Whether the family wanted him there is another of the questions that the record does not clearly answer. The war continued. The family continued. But something had shifted in George VI that those closest to him could see. The king who had found in the Blitz a purpose commensurate with his courage was now a king who was also grieving a brother. And the grief, characteristically, was not expressed but absorbed, added to the accumulating weight of a reign that had already demanded more than any reasonable assessment of the man would have predicted he could bear. He continued his visits to troops and factories in bombed cities. He continued his broadcasts, each one still rehearsed, with Logue, each one still an ordeal. He met with Churchill weekly, the 2 men developing a working relationship of mutual respect that deepened across the war into something closer to genuine affection. But those who saw him privately, Elizabeth, the staff at the palace, the equerry who accompanied him through his days, noted a tiredness that rest could not repair, a graying and a thinning that went beyond natural aging. The king was spending himself. He was spending himself as his father had expected the family to spend itself, entirely, in the service of the institution, without complaint and without reserve. Victory in Europe, when it came on the 8th of May, 1945, brought the most extraordinary scene of George VI's reign. The royal family on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, waving to a crowd that stretched from the palace gates to Trafalgar Square and beyond. The roar of that crowd, hundreds of thousands of voices released from 6 years of blackout and bombardment and fear, was audible inside the palace before the doors opened onto the balcony. George and Elizabeth stood at the center, with Churchill, with the princesses. The king waved, the queen smiled. The crowd sang and cheered and wept. And for one evening, the gap between the public image and the private reality closed entirely, because the country loved its wartime king with a sincerity that the king himself, in his perpetual anxiety about his own adequacy, had never quite believed in. The princesses, with the king's quiet permission, slipped out of the palace that night and joined the crowds. Elizabeth and Margaret, anonymous in the darkness, moving through the celebrating masses in a moment of freedom that both would remember for the rest of their lives. It was, in its small way, the most human thing the family did during the entire war. Two young women let loose into the city their father had refused to abandon, dancing and laughing among the people whose survival the family had come to symbolize. But the peace that followed was not kind to George VI, and it was not kind to the monarchy. The post-war years brought challenges that were, in their own way, as exhausting as the war itself. The Labour government of Clement Attlee, elected in a landslide in July 1945, transformed Britain with a radicalism that the monarchy had to navigate carefully. The National Health Service, the nationalization of key industries, the welfare state, the dismantling of the old social order that the crown had symbolized and that George V's household had embodied. The empire, which George VI had been crowned to lead as Emperor of India, was dissolving. Indian independence in August 1947 cost the king his imperial title. The partition of the subcontinent, with its catastrophic violence, added the layer of geopolitical grief to a reign already saturated with loss. Burma followed, Ceylon followed. The map was being redrawn, and the institution that Queen Mary had spent her life preserving was being redefined. Whether it welcomed the redefinition or not, through it all, the king's health was deteriorating in ways that the household managed with the same instinct for privacy that had governed the family since Queen Mary's girlhood. George VI had been a heavy smoker since his youth, a habit that the household had never discouraged, and that the extraordinary stresses of the war had intensified into a dependency. By the late 40s, the damage was accumulating with a momentum that lifestyle changes could not reverse. He developed arteriosclerosis, a hardening and narrowing of the arteries that affected the blood supply to his legs with such severity that by early 1949 he was in significant pain. In March of that year, a lumbar sympathectomy was performed, a surgical procedure to improve circulation, and a planned tour of Australia and New Zealand was cancelled. The king was ordered to rest. He rested with the impatience of a man who regarded rest as a form of failure, and he returned to his duties with the dogged persistence that had defined his entire approach to a role he had never wanted and never stopped serving. But the rest was not enough. The recovery was partial, and by the summer of 1951, new symptoms had appeared that the doctors could not attribute to circulatory disease alone. George was coughing. He was losing weight. He was experiencing a fatigue that went beyond the ordinary tiredness of a heavy smoker in his mid-50s. In September 1951, after a bronchoscopy revealed the truth, the diagnosis was confirmed to the family. The king had a malignant growth in his left lung. Cancer. The word was not spoken publicly. The palace announced only that the king would undergo a lung operation, but within the household, the implications were understood. Princess Elizabeth, now 25 and married to Philip since November 1947, was quietly briefed. Queen Mary, 84 and increasingly frail, was told. The family closed ranks around the diagnosis with the practiced efficiency of people for whom the management of private reality behind public composure was not merely a skill, but a way of life. The operation took place on the 23rd of September, 1951, at Buckingham Palace itself. The surgeons coming to the sovereign, not the sovereign going to the hospital, because the institution's instinct for control extended even to the operating table. George's entire left lung was removed. The procedure was successful in the narrow medical sense. The growth was excised, the patient survived, and the immediate recovery was better than the doctors had feared. But the broader prognosis was bleak. The cancer had been advanced. The loss of a lung left the king with diminished capacity and chronic vulnerability to respiratory infection. And the unspoken understanding that settled over the household in the autumn of 1951. Unspoken because this family did not speak of such things, not clearly, not aloud, was that the king was dying. Not in days, perhaps, not in weeks, but with the certainty that no amount of composure could manage into something other than what it was. The final months of George VI's life have the quality of an extended, quiet farewell conducted in the language of ordinariness. He convalesced at Sandringham through the autumn and into the winter of 1951 to 52, walking the grounds he had loved since childhood, shooting on the estate when his strength permitted, spending time with the family in the rooms where his own father had held court decades earlier. Elizabeth and Philip visited with the grandchildren, Charles, 3 years old, and Anne, just past her first birthday. And the sight of the next generation, toddling through the corridors of a house that had sheltered Windsors for half a century must have carried for the dying king a particular weight of both comfort and grief. He was thin. His face was drawn. The photographs from that winter show a man who has been pared back to essential structure, the flesh retreating from the bones, the eyes larger and more luminous in the narrowing face, the body consuming itself with the quiet, methodical efficiency of a disease the era's medicine could slow, but not stop. Christmas, 1951, was spent at Sandringham, as tradition required. George recorded his Christmas broadcast in advance for the first time. His voice was too fragile for a live transmission, and the recording was assembled from multiple takes, each one an effort that those present found difficult to witness. The broadcast, when it aired, sounded steady enough. The public heard a king who seemed tired but functional. The family heard something else, the last time his voice would enter the nation's living rooms. On the 30th of January, 1952, the family went to the Theatre Royal Drury Lane to see the musical South Pacific, a rare evening out, the kind of ordinary pleasure that the illness had made exceptional. George was photographed arriving at the theater, smiling, apparently well. The image was published in the papers the following morning. It is, in retrospect, one of the last public photographs of the king alive, and there is something in the careful, thin-faced smile that is almost unbearable to look at when you know what followed. On the 31st of January, the king stood on the tarmac at London Airport to wave goodbye to Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh, who were departing for a tour of East Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. The tour George himself had been forced to cancel 3 years earlier, now undertaken by his daughter in his place. He stood in the cold January wind, hatless, his overcoat hanging on a frame that had become noticeably thinner since the autumn. The wind pulled at his hair. He watched the aircraft taxi and lift and climb into the gray sky. And he stood there watching until the plane was out of sight. Those who were present noted how ill he looked, how transparent, how fragile, how much like a man who was saying goodbye to something he knew he would not see again. The photographs from the airport have been reproduced thousands of times since, because the people who took them did not yet know what they were recording. The last time a father saw his daughter, the last time a king appeared in public, the last glimpse of a life that had 6 days left to run. He returned to Sandringham. The days that followed were, by every account, among the happiest of his final months. He shot hares on the estate on the 5th of February, a cold, bright day, the Norfolk sky enormous above the flat fields, and bagged a good number, walking the grounds with the gamekeepers who had known him since childhood. He was reported by staff to be in excellent spirits, better than he had been in weeks, animated by the fresh air and the exercise and the particular contentment that Sandringham, of all the royal residences, had always given him. This was the house where he had been born. This was the estate where he had walked with his father and his brothers, where the shooting weekends had provided the closest thing to uncomplicated happiness that the household had ever known. He dined that evening with Princess Margaret and members of the household. The conversation was relaxed. He was cheerful. He retired to his ground floor bedroom. He had been sleeping on the ground floor since the lung operation made stairs difficult, so at around 10:30, he read. A watchman walking in the garden beneath the bedroom window saw the king adjusting his latch at approximately midnight. The night was cold. The house was quiet. Sandringham settled into the stillness of a winter night in Norfolk, the darkness outside absolute, the estate wrapped in the particular silence of flat country and frozen ground. Sometime in the early hours of the 6th of February, 1952. The exact time has never been established, and George VI died in his sleep, a coronary thrombosis, a blood clot that stopped the heart. He did not cry out, he did not wake. He went from sleep into death with a gentleness that the waking hours of his life had rarely permitted, the final transition accomplished without struggle, without stammer, without the visible effort that had characterized everything he had done since the abdication placed the crown upon him. He was 56 years old. He had been king for 15 years and 57 days. He had not wanted the throne, had not been prepared for it, had been terrified by it, and had carried it through a world war, the dissolution of an empire, the transformation of British society, and the quiet, relentless erosion of his own body with a courage that his stammer and his anxiety and his deep, persistent sense of inadequacy had never been able to extinguish. He had been the spare who became the sovereign, the stammering boy who addressed a nation at war, the second son who paid in the end with his life for the role his brother refused to carry. His valet, James MacDonald, found him in the morning. The details of the discovery possessed a terrible mundane specificity that always accompanies death in a familiar place. The door opening at the customary hour, the tray prepared, the room quiet, the body in the bed in a position that looked like sleep but was not sleep. The stillness that is different from rest in a way that the body recognizes before the mind has time to form the thought. MacDonald set down the tray. He approached the bed. He understood. The household was called. The king's equerry was summoned. A doctor came from the village, Dr. James Ansell, who examined the body and confirmed what the valet already knew. The news moved through Sandringham House in the grey February morning, with the particular awful momentum of a truth that cannot be unsaid, whispered in corridors, carried from room to room, reaching each person in the order that proximity and protocol determined. Queen Elizabeth, the queen consort who would become, in the coming months, Queen Elizabeth, the queen mother, was at Sandringham, and it was told immediately. Her grief, when it came, was private and devastating, the loss of the partnership that had sustained her for 29 years and that had defined, for both of them, the only genuine happiness either had known inside the institution. She would carry the grief for the rest of her life. 50 years of widowhood, the longest widowhood in modern royal history. And it would shape everything that followed: her relationship with her daughters, her attachment to the houses she and Bertie had shared, her retreat into a public persona that was warm and resilient and never again entirely unguarded. Princess Margaret was in the house. She had dined with her father the previous evening, the last meal he would eat, and the knowledge that she had been there, that she had sat across the table from him, talked with him, said good night, and gone to bed without knowing it was the last time, would haunt her in ways that contributed to the particular, restless unhappiness that defined her adult life. The telephone calls went out. Queen Mary was reached at Marlborough House in London, where she had been living since the end of the war. She was 84 years old. She had buried John at Sandringham in the January cold of 1919. She had buried George at Windsor in the August heat of 1942. And now Bertie, the anxious, stammering second son she had raised in the rigid household at York Cottage, the child who had absorbed every pressure the family system could impose, the boy whose knocked knees she had allowed to be splinted and whose left hand she had allowed to be retrained and whose vulnerability she had acknowledged in private but never accommodated in public, was gone too. 3 sons. Queen Mary had now outlived 3 of her 6 children. John at 13, George at 39, Bertie at 56. The first taken by epilepsy, the second by a plane crash, the third by a body worn through by smoking and stress, and the accumulated cost of a role that had never been his to carry, and that he had carried without respite until it killed him. Princess Elizabeth was in Kenya, with the treetops game lodge in the Aberdare forest. When the news reached the tour party, she had spent the previous night perched in a wooden observation platform above a watering hole, watching elephants and rhinoceroses move through the African dusk, one of the last entirely private experiences of her life. Though she did not yet know it, she was 25 years old. Philip was with her. The news came through in stages. First a Reuters flash picked up by the tour secretary, then a telephone call to the lodge, then the confirmation that no one wanted to deliver and no one wanted to receive. Philip took her aside. The precise words he used have never been made public, and Elizabeth herself never spoke of the moment in any detail that reached the record. She is said to have received the news with a composure that her grandmother would have recognized and her father would have admired. No visible collapse, no public tears, only the immediate instinctive assumption of the role that had been approaching her since her uncle's abdication 16 years earlier. She was now Queen Elizabeth II, the sovereign of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and head of the Commonwealth. And she had become so in a game lodge in the Kenyan highlands, thousands of miles from the palace, the parliament, the family, and the country she now had to lead. She changed into the black mourning clothes that royal tours always carry for precisely this contingency. She wrote letters. She made arrangements with the quiet, practical efficiency that would define her public manner for the next 7 decades. She returned to Nairobi. She boarded a plane for London. And when she descended the aircraft stairs at Heathrow, thin, young, dressed in black, her face held in the careful stillness of a woman who understands that the world is watching. The waiting dignitaries saw not a grieving daughter, but a queen. Churchill was there, and Eden and Attlee. They bowed. The rain had begun. The body of the king lay at Sandringham for 2 days before being moved to London. The coffin was carried from the house by estate workers, gamekeepers, gardeners, the men who had tended the grounds where George had walked and shot through the last weeks of his life. There was something in that detail, the king's body borne by the men who knew the land he loved best, that carried a weight no state ceremony could have matched. The coffin was taken by train to London, where it lay in state at Westminster Hall for 3 days. More than 300,000 people filed past in a queue that stretched along the embankment and across Lambeth Bridge. The funeral was held on the 15th of February, 1952, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same chapel where the Duke of Kent had been buried 10 years earlier, the same chapel that had witnessed royal grief so many times that its stones seemed by now to absorb sorrow as a function of their design. The kings and queens of Europe attended. Churchill was present, visibly aged by the grief he felt for a monarch he had come to admire profoundly, a man he had initially underestimated and had spent the war years learning to respect. The nation mourned with a sincerity that surprised even the most skeptical commentators, because George VI's death revealed, with the sudden clarity that only absence provides, something that his lifetime of anxious, stammering, self-doubting service had never quite been able to communicate while he was alive. How deeply, how completely the country had loved the king it never expected to have. Elizabeth, the new queen, stood at the funeral with the stillness and the self-possession that would define her public manner for the next 7 decades, a composure learned, perhaps, from the grandmother who sat behind her in the chapel. Beside her stood Philip. Behind her, in the pews, sat the surviving members of the family whose story this has been. Queen Mary, now the great-grandmother of the new reign, erect and jeweled in 84, her face a mask of the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting. Princess Margaret, 21, grief-stricken in a way she would carry into a life increasingly defined by loss and frustration. Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, steady as she had always been. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, present and dutiful. Marina, Duchess of Kent, who understood widowhood and the particular loneliness of raising royal children alone in a way that no one else in that chapel could match. The Duke of Windsor was not at the funeral. Whether he was not invited, or whether the circumstances made his attendance impractical, or whether the family simply preferred his absence is yet another detail that the record has failed to preserve with clarity. He was by this point a figure so far from the family's center that his presence or absence had become almost irrelevant, a fact that would have devastated the man who had once been the most popular prince in the empire, and that spoke more eloquently than any judgment could to the consequences of the choice he had made 16 years earlier. At Marlborough House, in the days after the funeral, Queen Mary sat among her collections, the antiques, the jade, the royal memorabilia she had gathered across a lifetime, and absorbed the latest in a series of losses that had begun before most of her grandchildren were born. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived John, the child who had been hidden. She had outlived George, the child who had burned brightest and been destroyed most suddenly. And now she had outlived Bertie, the child who had seemed least suited for the weight and who had carried it in the end to the point of physical destruction. She was 84. She was frail, and the institution she had spent her entire life serving, the crown, the dynasty, the name, had passed to a 25-year-old granddaughter who now faced the same choice that every member of this family had faced. How much of yourself do you give to the role, and what is left of you when the role has taken everything it needs? That question, for Queen Mary, had less than 13 months left to matter. Queen Mary did not attend the funeral. She was 85 by the time Bertie was buried, and her own health, fragile now, diminished by age and by the accumulated weight of a life that had required more endurance than most lives are asked to contain, did not permit the journey to Windsor. She remained at Marlborough House, the grand residence beside St. James's Palace where she had lived since the end of the war, surrounded by the collections she had assembled across 70 years, the jade, the miniatures, the Fabergé, the royal memorabilia that she had gathered with the acquisitive discipline of a woman who understood the objects endure when people do not. She waited. She received visitors. She listened to accounts of the funeral from family members who had attended. And she did what she had done after John's death in 1919, after George's death in 1942, and after every other loss that the century had inflicted. She absorbed the grief into the structure of discipline that had sustained her since childhood, the structure she had built from the raw materials of a precarious upbringing in Kensington Palace, and refined across 60 years of marriage, widowhood, war, and the relentless demands of an institution that asked everything and forgave nothing. In the weeks following Bertie's death, Mary performed an act that was, in its quiet way, one of the most revealing gestures of her entire life. She sent a message to the new queen, her granddaughter Elizabeth, now Elizabeth II, 25 years old and suddenly the sovereign of the United Kingdom and the head of the Commonwealth, making clear that the Queen Dowager's allegiance to the crown was absolute, and that the accession of a new monarch must take precedence over the personal grief of an old one. The institution came first. It had always come first. It would always come first. Mary had organized her entire existence around that conviction, had married for it, had borne children for it, had surrendered warmth and spontaneity and the ordinary comforts of maternal closeness for it, had buried 3 sons with it as her only armor. And she was not about to soften now, at 85, with the ground still fresh over Bertie's grave and a granddaughter on the throne, who would need the same conviction to survive what was coming. Mary had lived her entire existence inside that conviction, and she was not about to abandon it now at 85, with 3 children in the ground and a granddaughter on the throne. There is something about that gesture. The grandmother writing to the granddaughter, instructing her that duty overrides sorrow, that the crown matters more than the hearts of the people who wear it, transmitting across the generations the same hard, unyielding lesson that had governed Mary's own life, and that had shaped, for better and for worse, every one of her children, that captures the essence of everything this family's story has been about. It was magnificent in its discipline. It was also, depending on how you choose to look at it, devastating in its implications. Because the lesson Mary was transmitting was the same lesson she had transmitted to her own children half a century earlier. Feelings yield to function, grief yields to the role, and what you lose in the process is simply the price you pay for being born with the name. Queen Mary died on the 24th of March, 1953, 10 weeks before the coronation of her granddaughter, which had been scheduled for the 2nd of June at Westminster Abbey. She was 85. She had been Queen Consort for 25 years, Queen Dowager for the remaining 17 years of her life, and she had lived long enough to see the crown pass from her husband to her eldest son, to her second son, to her granddaughter. 4 transitions in 43 years. 2 of them traumatic, all of them managed with the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting. In her final weeks at Marlborough House, attended by her household and visited by family members who understood that each visit might be the last, she remained lucid, formal, and utterly herself. She left instructions, characteristically precise, that the coronation was not to be postponed on her account. The institution came first, even in death, especially in death. The coronation of Elizabeth II proceeded on the 2nd of June, 1953, and the empty seat where the Queen Dowager would have sat was draped in the colors of mourning, a visible absence that those who understood the family's story would have recognized as the most fitting tribute imaginable. Mary had spent her life being present for the institution. Her absence, when it came, was felt as sharply as her presence had ever been. She was buried beside George V at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 31st of March. The funeral was attended by the royal family, by foreign royalty, and by the diplomatic and political establishment that had known her across the reigns of 4 sovereigns. Churchill, who had observed her across more than half a century of public life, described her in terms that captured the institutional assessment perfectly. She had been the embodiment of everything the British monarchy aspired to represent. It was a generous tribute, and in its own frame of reference, it was accurate. Mary had been the monarchy's most disciplined servant. She had maintained the facade through pressures, war, scandal, abdication, bereavement, that would have destroyed a less resolute will. She had preserved the continuity that the crown required. The question that her funeral could not answer, the question that lingers over this entire story, like weather that will not lift, is whether the cost of that preservation had been borne disproportionately by the 6 people she was supposed to protect. The surviving children and their dependents scattered across the decades that followed, each carrying the family's inheritance into the second half of the century in ways that confirmed, one final time, how differently the same household could shape the lives that passed through it. Edward, Duke of Windsor, lived on in Paris for 20 more years after his mother's death. He and Wallis settled into a life of gilded purposelessness at their house in the Bois de Boulogne, a villa provided by the city of Paris, staffed and maintained to a standard that would have been impressive had it not served principally to disguise the fact that the couple at its center had nothing of substance to do. Edward played golf. He gardened with the fussy attention to detail that had once been directed at his public wardrobe. He wrote his memoirs, A King's Story, published in 1951, in which the abdication was presented as a noble sacrifice, rather than a constitutional betrayal, a framing that the family in London did not endorse and that historians have treated with varying degrees of sympathy. Wallis managed the household, the guest lists, and the social calendar with the organizational brilliance that was her most genuine talent, creating around the couple a miniature court that was beautiful, impeccable, and ultimately hollow, a performance of royalty without the substance, a simulacrum of the life Edward had given up. Their relationship with the family in London remained frozen in the particular glacial courtesy that the British establishment uses to express permanent disapproval. Edward visited England occasionally, for family funerals, for brief meetings with the Queen, but he was never welcomed back into the working life of the institution. The title of Royal Highness was never extended to Wallis. The bitterness of that exclusion never faded for Edward, who regarded it as a betrayal of the agreement he believed had been made at the time of the abdication, and who failed to the end to understand that the family's refusal was not merely personal, but structural. The institution could not forgive what he had done, because forgiving it would have been the same as accepting it, and accepting it would have undermined the entire principle on which the monarchy rested. He died in Paris on the 28th of May, 1972, of throat cancer. He was 77. In the final weeks of his life, he received a visit from the Queen, Elizabeth II, his niece, the granddaughter of the woman whose code he had broken, who came to Paris to see him. It was a gesture of family duty that Mary would have approved of, carried out with the restraint that Mary would have demanded. Edward's body was brought to England and lay in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Wallis attended the funeral, frail and visibly confused, in what would be her only significant visit to England as a widow. She returned to Paris and lived on for another 14 years, increasingly ill, her mind deteriorating in the house that had once been the center of a glittering social world. She died on the 24th of April, 1986, aged 89, and was buried beside Edward at Frogmore in the grounds of Windsor Castle. They lie together now, close to the castle, but not inside it, a final physical expression of the half-belonging that defined their lives. Princess Mary, the Princess Royal, continued in the role she had occupied since childhood, the dutiful one, the steady one, the sibling who served without drama and without public recognition beyond the circles in which she moved. She lived between Harewood House in Yorkshire, the great Palladian mansion filled with art and set in grounds designed by Capability Brown, that the Lascelles family had maintained since the 18th century, and her public engagements across the north of England and in London. Her marriage to the Earl of Harewood had been a partnership of institutional convenience rather than romantic passion. Lascelles had been a patron of the arts, a collector of some taste, and a man whose emotional register was set permanently to reserve. After his death in 1947, Mary lived as a widow at Harewood with the quiet, undemonstrative competence that had characterized everything she had done since the age of 15. She walked the grounds. She attended to estate business. She maintained her charitable connections. She was, in the family's larger story, the child who proved that the system could produce stability as well as damage, that not every son or daughter raised inside George V and Queen Mary's code of emotional containment emerged broken or rebellious. But her stability had come at the price of near total invisibility. And the fact that the most successfully adapted product of that household was also the least remembered by the public tells its own story about what the family noticed and what it failed to see. She collapsed and died at Harewood House on the 28th of March, 1965, age 67, while walking in the grounds she had inhabited for over 40 years. Her death was mourned within the family and noted in the press with the respectful brevity that attaches to lives of consistent, unspectacular service. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, returned from his posting as Governor-General of Australia in 1947 and settled into the long, quiet twilight that the family's less prominent members were permitted to inhabit. He and Alice lived at Barnwell Manor in Northamptonshire, a country house that suited Henry's temperament far better than any palace, a place of fields and farms and the kind of rural English life that the military-minded prince had always preferred to the rituals of the court. Their two sons, William and Richard, grew up in relative privacy. Henry continued to perform royal duties with the steady, unspectacular reliability that had defined his entire adult life, attending investitures and commemorations and the endless round of openings and inspections that the monarchy requires of its working members. He was the brother who had never wanted to be a prince, who had wanted to be a soldier, and who had been given instead a life of ceremonial service that honored his sense of duty without ever fully satisfying his need for purpose. In his later years, his health declined severely. A series of strokes left him increasingly incapacitated, his speech impaired, his mobility limited, his independence gone. Alice, the Duchess, became his primary care, managing his needs with a devotion that attracted little public attention, but that the family acknowledged privately as one of the most selfless acts of service in a generation defined by the word. Henry died on the 10th of June, 1974, at Barnwell Manor. He was 74 years old. He was the last surviving son of George V and Queen Mary, the final member of the generation that had been born at York Cottage, raised inside the household's rigid code, and scattered by its consequences across 7 decades of the 20th century. With his death, the 6 were all gone. Marina, Duchess of Kent, deserves her own reckoning in this aftermath, because her story after George's death was one of the most poignant in the family's history. She raised her 3 children, Edward, Alexandra, and Michael, through wartime and into the peace, navigating the peculiar challenges of royal widowhood with a grace and an independence that set her apart from the rest of the household. She was not by temperament a Windsor. She was a European princess who had married into the family and who brought to her widowhood the emotional openness and aesthetic sensibility of a different tradition. She returned gradually to public duties after the war, becoming one of the most admired members of the royal family. Admired for her style, her cultivation, her ability to convey warmth without sacrificing dignity. She was patron of numerous organizations. She attended state occasions with an elegance that made her conspicuous in a family not known for fashion. She raised her children to be functional, grounded, and connected to the wider world in ways that many royal children of that era were not. A quiet achievement that speaks well of Marina's judgment and badly of the system that had produced the generation before hers. She never remarried. Those who knew her well understood that the loss of George had not been a wound that healed with time, but a permanent alteration of her internal landscape. A room in the house of her life that remained furnished exactly as it had been on the 25th of August, 1942, and that she visited every day without speaking of it. She died on the 27th of August, 1968, at Kensington Palace of an inoperable brain tumor. She was 61. She had been a widow for 26 years. More than half her adult life spent without the husband who had been, for all his faults and all his glamour and all the trouble that had surrounded him before their marriage, the center of her emotional world. The stories this family left behind did not stay private. They entered the culture, retold, dramatized, reinterpreted through the lenses of successive generations, each retelling choosing a different wound through which to enter the family's history. And in doing so, they became something larger than biography. They became parables about power, duty, love, and the cost of maintaining a name that belongs to the nation as much as to the people who carry it. The first major dramatization to break the family's silence about its most hidden member was Stephen Polyakov's television film The Lost Prince, broadcast on BBC One in January 2003 and watched by more than 7 million viewers. The film told the story of Prince John with a sympathy and a specificity that the family's own reticence had never permitted. Daniel Williams played the young John with an unaffected warmth that made the child's isolation devastating rather than merely pitiable. Miranda Richardson's performance as Queen Mary was the production's most complex achievement. She played Mary not as a villain, but as a woman trapped inside a code she could not break, loving her son in the only way her nature and her position allowed, and failing him precisely because that love was never permitted to express itself freely. Tom Hollander appeared in a supporting role that added texture to the household's dynamics. Polyakov, who also wrote the screenplay, was careful not to reduce the story to accusation. He presented the family as people operating inside a system that could not accommodate a child with epilepsy, and that chose, as the system always chose, management over confrontation, privacy over honesty, the institution's image over the individual's need. The film was critically acclaimed, and it accomplished something that 84 years of royal silence had failed to do. It made John visible. It gave the lost prince a face, a voice, and a presence in the national consciousness that no amount of archival research could have achieved. 7 years later, Tom Hooper's The King's Speech brought George VI's stammer and the abdication crisis to a global audience of hundreds of millions. The 2010 film starred Colin Firth as George VI in a performance of such restrained physical specificity that it transformed the public understanding of who Bertie had been. Firth did not play the stammer as a metaphor. He played it as a bodily reality. The seized throat, the straining jaw, the silence that consumed words before they could form. And in doing so, he made audiences around the world feel what it had cost this man to perform the single most basic requirement of his role to speak. Helena Bonham Carter played Queen Elizabeth with the warmth and the steel that the real Elizabeth had brought to the marriage. Geoffrey Rush played Lionel Logue with an irreverence that captured the therapist's most important quality: his refusal to treat the Duke of York as anything other than a man with a problem that could be worked on. The film won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Firth, and it reshaped the public memory of George VI from a footnote between 2 more famous monarchs into the central, tragic figure of the 20th century Windsor story. What the film simplified: the chronology of the speech therapy, the political intricacies of the abdication. It more than compensated for an emotional truth. It understood that this was not a film about a speech impediment. It was a film about a man who was asked to do something he believed he could not do, and who did it anyway, and who was destroyed by the doing of it. The Crown, created by Peter Morgan and first broadcast on Netflix in November 2016, took the family's story to its widest and most sustained audience yet. The first 2 seasons, starring Claire Foy as Elizabeth II, Jared Harris as George VI, and in a performance that brought the Queen Dowager to vivid, chilling, sympathetic life, Eileen Atkins as Queen Mary, covered the period from George VI's final years through the early reign of Elizabeth II. Later seasons, with rotating casts, returned to the abdication, to Edward and Wallace, to the generational patterns that this story has traced across half a century. The Crown, what remains of Queen Mary's family, is both substantial and haunting. Substantial because the dynasty she helped preserve endures as the most prominent monarchy in the world, and haunting because the cost of that endurance is written into every branch of the family tree she planted. George VI's line leads directly to the present throne. His elder daughter became Elizabeth II, who reigned for 70 years and 214 days, longer than any British monarch in history. Before her death on the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral Castle, in the Scottish Highlands she had loved since childhood, she was 96. She had inherited the composure her grandmother perfected, the sense of duty her father embodied, and the instinct for institutional self-preservation that had been the family's defining quality since Queen Mary first learned, in that borrowed house in Florence, that survival required discipline above all else. Elizabeth II's death was mourned globally, her funeral watched by billions, her legacy debated with the intensity that attaches to any life, lived entirely in public view. Her son, Charles III, is now king, crowned on the 6th of May, 2023 at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony that echoed, in its setting and its ritual, if not in its circumstances, the coronation that had once been prepared for his great-uncle Edward, and that had been carried out instead by the stammering brother who replaced him. Charles is 77. He reigns over a United Kingdom that bears almost no resemblance to the one his grandfather was crowned to serve. A nation that has shed its empire, transformed its social structures, and entered a relationship with its monarchy that is more questioning, more conditional, and less deferential than anything George V or Queen Mary could have imagined. George VI's younger daughter, Margaret, lived a life that echoed in its own key every pattern this family has repeated across generations. The tension between private desire and public expectation, the cost of living inside a name that the nation claims as its own, the damage that accumulates when personal happiness is subordinated to institutional need. Her love for Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man who the church and the government deemed unacceptable, was thwarted by the same forces that had confronted her uncle Edward, though Margaret, unlike Edward, chose duty over love, a decision she made publicly and bore privately for the rest of her life. She married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, divorced him in 1978, and spent her later years in a restless, occasionally reckless pursuit of the pleasure and freedom that her position had always made difficult and her upbringing had never encouraged. She died on the 9th of February 2002. 6 weeks before her mother, Elizabeth the Queen Mother, who died on the 30th of March 2002, at the age of 101, having outlived her husband by exactly 50 years. The Kent line survives through George and Marina's 3 children, each of whom carried their parents' legacy into the 21st century. Edward, Duke of Kent, is now 89 years old, a working royal for more than 6 decades, a man who has attended thousands of engagements, supported hundreds of organizations, and conducted his public life with so little drama that most people outside the institution could not name a single thing he has done. That anonymity is, in its own way, an achievement. The son of the family's most glamorous and most troubled brother has lived a life of such steady, unglamorous service that he has become, without anyone particularly noticing, the embodiment of the code his grandmother believed in. His sister Alexandra, the Honorable Lady Ogilvy, is 88, still performing public engagements with an elegance and a warmth that recalls her mother's presence. And their brother Michael, Prince Michael of Kent, the baby born 7 weeks before his father's death on Eagle's Rock, the child who never knew the man whose name he carried and whose face he inherited, is 83. His physical resemblance to his late cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, has been remarked upon by every commentator who has ever photographed him, a genetic echo of the vanished world of European royalty that his mother Marina carried with her from Greece to England, and that survives now only in faces, in memories, and the photographs of people who have been dead for a century. The Gloucester line continues through Henry's younger son, Richard, the current Duke of Gloucester, who is 81 and who has served as a working royal since 1972. When his elder brother, Prince William, named for no particular ancestor, a quiet, private young man who had wanted a life outside the institution, was killed in an air race near Wolverhampton. Another death, another crash, another spare stepping into a role intended for an heir. The pattern repeats. It has always repeated. Richard's wife, Birgitte, Duchess of Gloucester, serves alongside him. They live at Kensington Palace. They attend their engagements. They represent the crown with the steady, unpublicized dedication that has characterized the Gloucester branch since Henry first put on a uniform and asked to be allowed to serve. Edward and Wallis left no children. Princess Mary's descendants live privately, connected to the crown by blood but not by public function. And John, Prince John, the youngest, the epileptic child who lived his final years at Wood Farm with Lalla Bill and who died in his sleep on a January night in Norfolk at the age of 13, left nothing. No wife, no children, no adult life, no legacy except the silence that surrounded him and the belated, imperfect recognition that came 8 decades after his death, when a filmmaker and then a nation decided that his story deserved at last to be told. Queen Mary built a dynasty. She preserved the institution through pressures that would have shattered it in lesser hands: the Great War, the General Strike, the abdication, the Blitz, the dissolution of the empire she had been crowned to serve. She raised 6 children inside a code of discipline so total that it became, for those children, the only atmosphere they knew how to breathe. 2 of them, John and George, died before they should have, one hidden and one destroyed in circumstances so random that no amount of composure could make sense of them. One of them, Edward, fled the institution entirely, choosing love or selfishness or honesty over duty, depending on who is telling the story and what they need the story to mean. One of them, Bertie, carried the institution on his back through a world war and the remaking of a nation and died at 56. Worn through by the accumulated cost of a role that was never meant to be his and that he fulfilled with a courage the role itself could never repay. One of them, Mary, served without complaint and without recognition and died as she had lived, quietly, in the house she had occupied for 40 years. One of them, Henry, did what was asked of him and was forgotten almost before the asking was done. The public saw continuity, the crown passed from head to head, the name endured. And the private reality, the stammering boy, the hidden child, the glamorous son destroyed on a Scottish hillside, the mother who outlived 3 of them and bore every loss behind a face the world mistook for strength, was folded into the silence that this family has always mistaken for love. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss another story.